Now we look at the Lewis model as given in the book by Todaro and Smith. Okay, this is their graphical presentation. I hope all of you can see this.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So this is how Todaro and Smith presented the same Lewis model we discussed just now. So we first consider the traditional agricultural sector portrayed in these diagrams. This is the agricultural sector. This is the these are the diagrams for the industrial sector. The upper diagram shows how subsistence food production varies with increase in labor inputs. It is a typical agricultural production function in which total product TPA of food is determined by changes in the amount of the only variable factor labor, LA, given a fixed quantity of capital K A bar and unchanging technology T A bar. So this is the production function of the agricultural sector. In this diagram, what do we find? We have the average and marginal product curves APLA and MPLA, which are derived from the total product curve. The quantity of agricultural labor measured here available is the same on both the axes and it's expressed in millions of workers. Just remember this, these are expressed in millions of workers, as there is a difference between this diagram and this diagram, because here quantity of labor is measured in thousands of workers. So here we are measuring in millions of workers. Now Lewis makes two assumptions about the traditional sector. There is surplus labor in the sense that marginal product of labor is equal to 0. That is, any labor above this is surplus labor. Marginal product of labor curve cuts the x-axis at this point here. MPLA is equal to 0. Any labor above this level is termed as surplus labor. All rural workers share equally the output so that the rural real wage is determined by the average and not the marginal product of labor. This rural wage is determined by average product, not marginal product. Now, what is WA? WA is TPA by LA. That is WA. And this is our employment of labor. The marginal product of LA workers is 0, as we can see from this diagram. Hence, the surplus labor assumption applies to all workers in excess of this level of labor. Now we come to this diagram. What does it show? It shows the total product for the modern industrial sector. Now, this form of total product, you are very well aware. We have learnt about it in classes, in previous classes. Now, output of the manufacturing sector, that is TPM, is a function of the variable input labor LM for a given level of capital stock KM bar and technology TM bar. On the horizontal axis, the quantity of labor employed to produce an output of, say, TPM 1, this output, TPM 1 with capital stock KM1 is expressed in thousands of urban workers L1. In the Lewis model, the modern sector capital stock is allowed to increase from KM1 to KM2 to KM3. Likewise, when capital stock increases, we know that our total product curves shifts upward. So when we have a capital stock of KM1, our total product curve is TPM, KM1. When it increases to KM2, the total product curves becomes this one. When it increases to KM3, our total product curve becomes this one. The process that will generate the capitalist profits for investment and growth is illustrated in this diagram. Here we have modern sector marginal product curves derived from the TPM curves of the above diagram. The assumption of perfectly competitive labor markets in the modern sector, marginal product of labor curves are the actual demand curves for labor. I hope you've understood this point. We have assumed perfectly competitive labor markets in the modern sector. That means marginal product of labor curves are the actual labor demand curves. Now, how does this system work? WA is the average level of real subsistence income in the traditional rural sector, and WM, the real wage in the modern capitalist sector. At this wage, the supply of labor is supposed to be absolutely elastic, that is perfectly elastic, and it is shown by the horizontal line WMSL. This implies that at the urban wage WM greater than WR, the rural wage, or WA, whatever you can say, modern sector employers can hire as many surplus rural workers as they want without fear of rising wages. Given a fixed supply of capital KM1, we are considering first this curve. With a fixed supply of capital KM1 in the initial state of the modern sector growth, the demand curve for labor is determined by labor's declining marginal product and is shown by this negatively sloped curve D1 KM1. Profit maximizing modern sector employers are assumed to hire laborers to the point where marginal physical product is the real wage, that is point F here. This implies total modern sector employment is OL1. Total product in the modern sector is OD1F L1. Amount paid in wages is OWMF L1. So amount of profit is WMD1F. Now, Lewis assumes that, which we have already learned, that all of these profits are reinvested. That implies that total capital stock in the modern sector rises from K1 to KM1 to KM2, and we get a total product curve of TPM KM2. This leads to a rise in marginal product curve, or the demand curve, we can call it, to D2 K M2. We get a new equilibrium G. Total output increases to this area OD2 GL2, and total wage payment increases to OWMGL2. Total profit has also increased. This again gets reinvested, and this process goes on. This process of modern sector self-sustaining growth and employment is assumed to continue until all surplus rural labor is absorbed into the industrial one. Now, after this, then additional workers can be withdrawn from the agricultural sector only at a higher cost of lost food production, because the declining labor to land ratio means that marginal product of rural labor is no longer zero. This is known as the Lewis turning point, which we got to know in Kaushik Basu's explanation too. The labor supply curve becomes positively sloped. It's no longer horizontal, it is positively sloped as modern sector wages and employment continue to grow. This implies the structural transformation of the economy has taken place, with the balance of economic activity shifting from traditional agriculture to modern industry. Is it clear up till here?
Yes, ma'am.
No questions?
না ম্যাম
Huh?
না ম্যাম বুঝেছি
আচ্ছা, খুব ভালো কথা তাহলে। Now we'll move on to the criticisms. Lewis two-sector development model is simple and roughly reflects the historical experience of economic growth in the West. However, four of its key assumptions do not fit the institutional and economic realities of most contemporary developing countries. First, number one, the model implicitly assumes that the rate of labor transfer and employment creation in the modern sector is proportional to the rate of modern sector capital accumulation. That implies faster rate of capital accumulation leads to higher growth rate of the modern sector and faster rate of new job creation. But what if the capitalists reinvest their profits in more sophisticated labor saving capital equipment rather than duplicating the existing capital as is implicitly assumed in the model? We go on to the next figure so we can understand. Here, what is happening? Initially, the marginal product curve is this D1, D1, K1. Now, as before, we assume that capitalist has earned this much of profit and the wage payment as a whole was this much. This rectangle, that is OWMEL1. Capitalist reinvest his entire profit. We do not change any of the assumptions. They reinvest the entire profit. what happens? The marginal product curve shifts, but does not shift as we had seen in the earlier two presentations of this model. How does it do it? It shifts in this manner. Then what happens? The total product has increased a lot. That is, it has increased to O, D2, E, L1. The wage payment remains the same. That is OWMEL1. So what have the capitalists done? They have used labor saving technology for increasing production. So all of the extra output accrues to the capitalists in the form of profits, which implies anti-developmental economic growth. That is, all the extra income and output are distributed to a few owners of capital, while income and employment level for the mass of workers remain largely unchanged. This implies, although total GDP would rise, there would be little or no improvement in aggregate social welfare measured in terms of more widely distributed gains in income and employment. Now, the next criticism is that whether surplus labor exists or not in modern day less developed economy. The notion that surplus labor exists in rural areas while there is full employment in the urban area is a questionable assumption. Many contemporary research indicates that there is little surplus labor in rural location. True, there are both seasonal and geographic exceptions to this rule. For example, until recent times in parts of China and the Asian subcontinent, some Caribbean islands, and isolated regions of Latin America, where land ownership is very unequal. But by and large, development economics today agree that Lewis's assumption of surplus labor, rural surplus labor, is generally not valid. The third assumption is the notion of competitive modern sector labor market that guarantees the continued existence of constant real urban wages up to the point where the supply of rural surplus labor is exhausted. Prior to the 1980s, a striking feature of urban labor markets and wage determination in almost all developing countries was the tendency for these wages to rise substantially over time, both in absolute terms and relative to average rural incomes, even in the presence of rising levels of open modern sector unemployment and low or zero marginal productivity in agriculture. Institutional factors such as union bargaining power, um, civil service wages, wage scales, and multinational corporations hiring practices tend to negate the competitive forces in the modern sector labor markets in developing countries. We all know that wages rise in the urban sector and it is not constant. Here it is said that it is constant until the entire surplus labor is absorbed. This is not the case. Much before the surplus labor is absorbed, the wages in the urban sector tends to rise. The last criticism is that The Lewis model, in its assumption of diminishing returns in the modern industrial sector. There is much evidence that increasing returns may prevail in this sector, posing special problems for development policy making. So here we come to the end of our discussion on Lewis model. If you have any questions, you can ask.
Ma'am.